Tom, thank you for having me. Your studio is incredible, and I want to talk about all of that, but let's start with when you fell in love with photography.
I guess I kind of started as a hobby, like a lot of people do. In college, I started out as an economics major, just because I wasn't sure what I wanted to do. At the same time, my dad had given me a camera as a birthday gift, so I was kind of, doing stuff with the camera while I was at school, and just as a hobby, but got more and more interested in that. I'd go out on the weekends and shoot landscapes and go out with my friends and do pictures and come back and develop the film. And I actually signed up to work on the yearbook staff so I could have access to a dark room at school. So I was kind of doing that stuff, and it just sort of developed from there. I ended up changing my major, and I had to do a little bit of summer school to kind of graduate in 4 years.
Did you think that you were creative? Did you see yourself as an artistic kind of person?
Once I changed my major, I kind of felt like it was easy for me to do the assignments. I don't know if I really felt like I had a great talent for it, but I enjoyed the challenges, and it sort of came easy to me. Then kind of getting out into the real world and being an assistant and seeing a professional photographer work, then I think you really start learning how to do your craft at that point.
Tell me about that, about being an assistant and working with someone who may or may not have the same aesthetic. Is it more focusing on that mechanical aspect, or what did you take away from that experience?
Well, you need to learn how the camera works, before you can really translate everything that you see into kind of a finished piece. So I was really super lucky to get in with a guy that his background was more sort of architectural interior type photography. He had worked in Chicago at a studio called Hedrick Blessing, and they did work for Better Homes and Garden, and he was used to like big sets and big, he lit things. So, I was just trying to figure out how all that stuff worked at first. So, I had a really good teacher. I felt like he had pieces in, or some of his work in CA. He was nationally, really successful photographer. So I was super lucky. When you're working with somebody like that, you just pick stuff up every day. It's like, wow, it was a cool experience.
Tell me about the evolution of your career. You start as an assistant, and what happens from there?
I was learning, basically, how to process film, how to load sheet film into a film holder. I was making black and white prints. I was, loading the car. I was taking his car to the car wash, cleaning his golf clubs, just everything like that. So I worked there probably 4 years, and by the time I left, I had a pretty good handle on things technically. I was using different format cameras. He shot the majority of the stuff on a view camera, which is a real simple, you learn the basics of how a camera works with that thing. And then, he had 2 1/4 format, which is a little smaller, and then 35 millimeter. So I got to use, and he had a great variety of equipment. So I got to be pretty comfortable with those types of cameras. So I had a pretty good handle on, sort of a recording an image. So, at that point it was more up to sort of having a good vision and being able to translate that on a job. I didn't do a lot of fine art photography. The stuff I did, would have a concept that you would start with that and then have to translate it, or, actually do it exactly, like they wanted. At that point in time, the art directors were still hand drawing comps. Like, you'd get a layout to follow and it would be hand drawn. So it would leave, some interpretation. which was nice. You know, later on, all the layouts they'd use stock photography in them, so the client, you know, would see that, and if you didn't, you know,
replicate it.
if you didn't replicate it, you know, it was like, oh, you know, they'd want to use the stock photograph. If you know, so I learned how to sort of duplicate other people's work, which was a challenge, I guess, but also rewarding if I could do it well.
Well, it's obvious that you translate those visions quite well. You have been very successful. Go ahead and name drop. Let's talk about some of the really high-profile individuals you have been able to photograph.
I have been lucky. You know, I've had some political figures that I've been able to photograph, and you know, sports figures, and I don't know. They've all been. I don't know. I got to photograph Tucker Carlson, you know, last year, and that, you know, all my portraits or projects like that have been involved with, you know, my commercial work. So, you know, it might have been an athlete that, you know, was endorsing a product that I was, you know, at the time doing work for that company. So, you know, doing those type things and kind of high profile portraits are part of the attraction to me. I like to do kind of lifestyle-y like things, and I like to, you know, photograph people, and a lot of times you don't have a lot of time to get to know somebody, so that's a fun challenge for me, is to kind of quickly form a rapport and be able to get you know, make the person feel comfortable and make them enjoy, you know, typically people don't enjoy being photographed. So, you know, you need to kind of figure out how much time an executive might have, you know, explain what you want to do, kind of try to form a you know, a rapport quickly, and, you know, that is really an attraction for me. So a lot of the high profile people, you know, they're photographed all the time, so, you know, you just have to try to not be intimidated and just, you know, treat them like a normal person, and typically things go pretty well. Be yourself. You know, these people are just like you are. You know, they want to get through the photograph. You know, they're not necessarily going to enjoy it, and you are nervous. But I think once you get started, you know, you kind of have an idea of what you want to do, and it just kind of all happens.
You mentioned you do a lot of product photography. What are the challenges there? Because I can imagine that when you're photographing a person, obviously there's some personality there, and the hope is to capture that. But when you have a still life or a product, how do you show that personality?
Depending on the product, you know, I think the lighting is super critical, and you know, that's something that I just do what I think looks good. You know, I kind of start there, and if the photo director doesn't, if we don't see eye to eye, then you know, you start making changes from there. But you know, let's say you have a concept. Let's say you're photographing a handbag, or you know, whatever, and you might have a layout, or you know, it might be a food item, or you know, it's sitting on a counter and there's sun coming in, and you know, you have to duplicate that lighting. And I just start doing it the way I think it looks good, until the point where the photo director says, you know, this isn't coming together, you know, we need to do this, blah, blah, blah. And that's where, you know, I think the job gets enhanced at that point.
How do you feel like your work has evolved since that college kid who got the first camera and thought he was pretty hot stuff?
Right. I think I used to kind of be really tight and try to control lighting, you know, and have everything all figured out ahead of time, and having the camera locked down on a tripod, and you know, an art director doesn't want a million shots of the same angle. You know, they want you to, you know, get the camera in hand and move around and give them different angles and just, you know, loosen up. And I kind of did the same thing with lifestyle. I'd kind of be all freaked out about, you know, working with models and stuff, and you know, I just kind of needed to loosen up and, you know, move around more and not get so focused on, having all the lighting perfect. And I think that's probably where I have improved the most.
What makes you excited to get out of bed every day?
I think the people that I work with, the clients that come in, I have a pretty good variety of people that I work with. The assistants are fun. Depending on what size crew, you might have 5 or 6 people. You might have a digital tech, you might have a couple of people that help you with lighting. So, there are all kinds of, the challenges of photographing a doctor. It's like, how much time is he going to have? Is he going to be a jerk? Some of the guys don't have any time. They don't want to be in there doing a photograph. You have to, be able to handle that. It's like, all that stuff is kind of exciting to me.
Despite the challenges, is it safe to say that this is your dream job?
Yeah, it's just like a really low-key business. In general, most of the crews that you work with, and just like the crew here filming this, everybody's pretty mellow, and I like that part a lot. It's like a family.
Tom, it has been such a joy to sit down with you. Your work is beautiful, your studio is beautiful. It was really a privilege, so thank you.
Well, I appreciate it. I'm really honored that you guys came in, and it's been really fun. Hopefully you got something out of it.
Absolutely, and the pleasure was mine. Thank you. For more information, visit GallagherStudio.com.
Arts in Focus on PBS Fort Wayne is funded in part by